The letter arrived, cold and final. Lena's garden gnomes were deemed a violation by the HOA. But when she uncovered a hidden clause in the bylaws, everything changed. A chance to fight back and turn the tables on them. What happened next? Even the HOA couldn't have predicted it. Lena Thompson was just an ordinary homeowner, living in a quaint neighborhood on the outskirts of Nashville. For years, she had carefully crafted a beautiful garden, a patch of vibrant color and life that she adored. At the heart of it were her garden gnomes, quirky little characters, each with its own personality. The gnomes were more than just decorations. They had become a symbol of her joy, a shared wonder for the neighborhood children who passed by every day, smiling at the collection of colorful, whimsical figures. Then, one afternoon, disaster struck. She retrieved a letter from her mailbox, the envelope stark and official. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA. As Lena opened it, her eyes scanned the words that cut through her peaceful day like a knife. "You are in violation of our community standards. Remove all garden decorations or face a fine." Her heart sank. The gnomes, once the pride of her garden, were now deemed an eyesore. The rules she had never paid much attention to, those faceless regulations that lurked in the background of neighborhood life, suddenly seemed all too real. Lena's immediate reaction was disbelief. The HOA, led by a group of overly strict individuals who seemed to thrive on micromanaging the smallest details of everyone's lives, had always been a mild inconvenience. But this was personal. Her garden was her sanctuary, a space where she could express herself. To have it labeled as an offense by a group of strangers who had never even taken the time to appreciate it felt like an attack. It wasn't just about the gnomes. It was about the control over her own space, her own life, being stripped away. The letter left her in shock, a mix of anger and helplessness rising inside her. The joy she'd once felt working in her garden was now replaced by frustration. How could they? How could they dictate what she did in her own yard, a place she had poured so much love into? Her carefully curated little world, the one thing she had complete control over, was now under siege. As the days passed, Lena's frustration deepened, gnawing at her every thought. The decision to remove her garden gnomes felt like an unthinkable defeat, and the source of it all was the HOA president, Karen Matthews. Lena knew Karen well, too well. She was the kind of person who thrived on petty authority, finding pleasure in enforcing every minute rule and regulation, no matter how trivial. The fact that Karen had focused so much energy on her beloved gnomes made Lena's blood boil. It felt both insulting and infuriating that this controlling woman had decided to turn something so personal into an issue. Lena lay awake at night, restlessly pacing her living room floor, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Should she give in? Should she just pay the fine and rid her garden of the gnomes to avoid a bigger confrontation? The very thought made her stomach churn. No, that wasn't right. The gnomes represented something more than just decorations. They were a symbol of freedom, creativity, and a spirit of playfulness that she cherished. In a neighborhood where conformity reigned, her little garden was one of the few places that allowed for a sense of individuality. And now it was under attack. The idea of complying, of giving up what she'd worked so hard to create, felt like a betrayal to herself. But the fine, the constant threat of losing her personal space, pressed heavily on her. She couldn't just sit back and let it happen. This wasn't just about gnomes. It was about standing up for her rights, for her freedom of expression. The thought of Karen Matthews dictating what she could or couldn't do with her own property was simply unacceptable. Lena steeled herself. She wasn't going to let Karen win. Something about the ruling didn't sit right with her. There was more to this than just a simple complaint about garden decorations. Lena was determined to find out exactly what that was. The next step was clear. She would dig deeper, uncover whatever hidden agenda was driving this decision. She wasn't backing down. After weeks of poring over the HOA regulations, combing through dusty documents, and speaking to neighbors who had suffered under Karen's tyrannical rule, Lena finally found it. A tiny clause, almost invisible, buried deep in the HOA's bylaws. It had been overlooked for years, ignored by everyone but the most meticulous reader. The rule stated that any member of the HOA could request a review of the association's rules if a regulation was deemed excessive or unfair. It wasn't a loophole, but it was a technicality, and it was Lena's ticket out of this mess. Armed with this knowledge, she called a meeting with the HOA board, knowing that this would be her one shot. The day arrived, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. Lena walked into the meeting room with a quiet, determined resolve. Karen Matthews, perched at the front of the room with her usual smug demeanor, locked eyes with her the moment she entered. Lena could feel the weight of Karen's gaze, the silent judgment, the expectation that she would fold under the pressure. But Lena wasn't going to back down this time. This was her moment. She stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest as she presented the clause to the room. With steady hands, she laid out the technicality that gave her a legitimate reason to challenge the HOA's ruling. "This regulation," Lena said, her voice clear and measured, "is too vague, too subjective. The bylaws give no clear definition of what constitutes an eyesore. It's an arbitrary judgment based on one person's opinion, and that isn't something the HOA can enforce." The room fell into an unnerving silence. Lena could feel every pair of eyes on her, but she kept her gaze locked on Karen, whose smug expression began to falter. There was no denying the logic in Lena's words. The bylaws were flawed, and they knew it. Lena finished her argument and leaned back, her breath shallow but steady. Now, all she could do was wait. Wait for the board's verdict. The ball was in their court, and for the first time, Lena felt like she might actually have the upper hand. The meeting dragged on for what felt like hours, but eventually, the board members reluctantly voted. The motion passed. Karen's attempt to ban Lena's gnomes was nullified. To add salt to the wound, the HOA was forced to reimburse Lena for the fines she had paid, and they were required to update their guidelines to ensure a fairer, more transparent process moving forward. Lena couldn't contain her satisfaction. Not only had she fought back against petty authority, but she had exposed the flaws in the system. She was vindicated, and Karen Matthews, who had relished her small moments of power, had been publicly humiliated. As Lena returned home, her garden gnomes, now more cherished than ever, stood proudly in her yard. The neighborhood children came by again, smiling and waving. For Lena, this victory wasn't just about saving her gnome collection. It was about standing up to an unjust system and restoring a sense of fairness. And that felt like the greatest victory of all.